David is has a background in perfusion, is a perfusionist, and is currently a transplant perfusionist specialist at the Cambridge University Hospital. And his talk will be about perfusion, or has the title, Perfusion and Torpor, Techniques as Precursors for Human Cryopreservation. David, take it from here.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share with you a couple of ideas that come from transplantation that may be useful in the in improving the prospects for successful human cryopreservation. But I wish to point out that this is a, a personal view. Okay, so as yes, I'm a perfusionist, and my background is for many years has been a perfusionist in heart surgery and transplantation of all kinds, as well as in the intensive care unit looking after patients on long-term bypass systems. This is a recent photograph of a colleague of mine looking after a patient, COVID patient, on veno bypass. Okay, so I'm interested in looking at trying to change the odds and therefore improving the prospect. And by doing that, I was thinking of something called the Warren equation, which was from an essay published in 1989 by Harris, looking at basically the odds, the probabilities of chronics being successful. And they came out with a lot of different elements and gave a weighting for them all, and therefore an overall prospects for success, which as you go along becomes very, very limited. I looked at this and thought, well, probability C, the favourable conditions of suspension, can possibly be elevated, and so therefore improve our odds. So that's really where I'm coming from. And so in order to do that, I want to talk first about circulatory arrest. In other words, how we die, and talking about energy loss and catecholamine storm. Also to look at how perhaps mild hypothermia as the first step could help to make a bridge between limited resuscitation to more extensive resuscitation. How that might apply in a perfusion settings for not only for organ preservation, which I'm using as my template, but also for resuscitation of the chronics patient, and that would be step 2. And how that may impact on the more rapid recovery of patients from cryopreservation. Okay, so let's looking at this rather colourful graph, which shows between age 1 to age 95 in 5-year strips, the likelihood of you dying from any major disease. But at the end of the day, normally what really happens is that you're not dead until you're cardiac dead, until your heart has stopped. So that's what I'm really going to concentrate on. And if we think of it from a metabolic point of view, from a metabolic debt point of view, we would see as a patient reaches the end of their life and they move from unconsciousness into Cheyne-Stokes, into the agonal phase, into a cardiac arrest situation. And the patient is declared dead at that point. However, I would suggest that actually the decline is actually much more severe during the time when the heart is still beating or trying to beat, and providing extremely bad conditions for the cells, primarily because of increased levels of cytokines, which are occurring at this time, leading to something called a cytokine storm, which is devastating. If we look at just the heart itself, then the simple consequences of having increasing demands on its viability and a reducing oxygen supply means that bad things happen and continue to happen more rapidly, leading eventually to cell death and anaerobic metabolism and cardiac arrest. So ischemia, the problem is that once we move from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism, what do we see? We see a huge increase in energy consumption. And so therefore energy is rapidly depleted. and metabolites then accrue. And so we're leading to this concept of, in simple terms, of a battery that's discharging and you're unable to recharge it. I'd like now to sort of step across to look at a little bit of hibernation, not the way that we see things in science fiction movies, but in actual medical practice. And when we look at medical practice, particularly in cardiac surgery, what we see is that if you're at normal thermia, 37 degrees approximately, and you've had a very good circulation up until the moment that your heart is stopped, that you've got about 4 or 8 minutes before you start to experience any level of brain damage or dysfunction. Now, as you cool, you get additional time, perhaps as much as 60, 65 minutes, but you'll notice something about these curves, that as the temperature decays, the increase in time is not quite what we would hope for. So if something else is going on. We're not actually hibernating animals. We can't change our metabolism to affect great benefits that hibernating animals do. So we're going to have to make do, for the moment at least, with mild medical hypothermia. And this will slow metabolism. This will be safe down to 32, 30 degrees, provides good cellular protection, and is simple to effect with techniques such as cardiopulmonary resuscitation, using anesthetics and topical cooling. And there's the potential of using chemical induction, which has been used in animals such as adenosine and hydrogen sulfide. And the idea with this is that, yes, the batteries are going to be discharging, but at least they're discharging more slowly and will buy you time to get to a more extensive facility. So, and yes, this is a thing. Yes, we do this in clinical practice. It's done medically. So this is good. The bad side is that you hit a point where bad things happen, and we find that this doesn't work much below 30 degrees, and 28 being kind of the barrier under which this won't work in a rescue setting. And the reason for this is very simple. Most of the processes within the body, major processes in the body, are temperature dependent, and some will just go into dysfunction faster than others when you lower the temperature. And so those have a detrimental effect on the utility of more profound hypothermia. The one thing that we're trying to do, which is reduce the metabolism, yes, that's fine, that works, tick the box. But we do have other elements such as an increased risk of infection, reduction in platelet count, resulting in additional bleeding. Cardiovascular is an issue because once you hit 28 degrees, your heart will arrest. And, actually having seen that in a live setting, I know this to be true. So how do we can apply this in a chronic setting? Hopefully not by the roadside, but at least we can apply this simple techniques such as cardiopulmonary resuscitation, ventilating the lungs with oxygen, applying a drug protocol such as an anesthetic, such as propofol, which will lower metabolism all by itself, and heparinize the patient so that you prevent clotting. Using cooling blankets and wraps to systemically cool the patient, topically cool the patient, and possible endo-cooling systems which will make that cooling much more rapid. Cooling down to 30 is possible, and this is to enable by time for you to indulge in something a bit more radical. And that I'm proposing is the use of extracorporeal perfusion for the chronic patient. This is done for donor organs, donor patients, and it is successful in restoring metabolism and getting control of all the parameters that you need to be successful there, as well as providing deep cooling should it be needed. But it is relatively expensive and requires training, but it does put the patient back on the mains and so enables the batteries to be recharged. So the model that I want to examine a bit more closely is the difference between donation following brain death and donation following circulatory death. Now, the two are distinct in that the the brain dead group can be considered to be preagonal. In other words, their circulation is very good until their organs are removed. So the organs tend to be well perfused, in a good state, and they're not toxic in any way. Unlike the circulatory death patients, the post-agonal patients, which their organs are in a poor state and are often show poor utility. And this is demonstrated in many studies, so I won't go into that, but just to say that the evidence is there. So what have we chosen to do over the past decade or so is to use an extracorporeal circuit as an intervention into trying to prevent that deleterious effects occurring. So what we're trying to do is to treat that hypoxic agonal stage, that warm stage, and restore the organs back to a good quality for removal and retransplantation by increasing their energy stores and removing their metabolites, and so therefore making them more robust to survive by something called a reperfusion injury. So it's just really a question of recharging those batteries. So a couple of slides here suggesting that, yes, DCD organs can be improved in this way, and we're doing it as a routine now. So we can use the big heart-lung machine, which we use for cardiac surgery, and it's got a really complicated circuit that's attending to it, but we don't need that. A simple circuit is adequate, and it's simply just an in and an out, a pump, an oxygenator, a heat exchanger. Here is one that's being used for a donor patient, someone who's died from circulatory arrest, who's being resuscitated to a point whereby their organs can be removed. So that's the premise. The other thing that's required, and we also use a device with the donor organs, donor patients, is something called a cytokine absorber. And this removes these activated cytokines and enables, again, an improvement in the quality of the organs. So in the chronic setting, the step 2 is to establish bypass to rewarm patients surprisingly up to normal temperatures. And the reason we want to do this is because we want to normalize biochemistry, and that takes about 2 to 4 hours. So we want to recharge the batteries. We also want to remove the activated cytokines. And the reason for this is because they are immensely damaging to the circulation and impede the quality of the perfusion. So looking at the cytokine storm, the otherwise known as the immune-mediated hyperinflammatory state, a whole shed load of interleukins are activated, and these are very destructive. And if we show you this little animation, I hope that you can see that in the red boxes at least, that the circulation has been impeded. Now, using some sort of high-capacity cytokine absorber, those metabolites can be removed, the cytokines removed, and the circulation is restored. This is a device that's being used extensively in this year that we're in, as far as COVID-19 patients are concerned. So this is real stuff. So it's very simple. The idea is that we clip the top off the toxicity of this cytokine, enabling recovery to take place. Clearly, this is really quite a complex area and something that I can't go into any more detail here, so we'll move on. Just to say that, yes, it does actually have a positive impact on patient recovery, as shown by these lactic acid results. Okay, so what have we done so far? We've rewarmed the patient on ECMO, we've recharged the batteries, we've normalized biochemistry, we've fixed the cytokine problem, and now we commence deep cooling, lowering the hemoglobin, because we want to make the blood thinner by removing excess cellular components to help in the perfusion as we cool. And then at an appropriate point, move to a conventional chronic vitrification process, chronic cool down protocol. And then at the deep cooling phase, we would, suggestion is that perhaps as a possibility that we could use microparticles perfused by the machine to infiltrate all of the capillary beds for later magnetic or ultrasonic preservation rewarming. So at the end of the the chronic process, one, the patient is being reanimated, then this may be a way of getting appropriate core rewarming rather than having to rely on very exotic nanotechnology. So that's looking at this a little bit more closely, we know that, and it's been itemized by previous speakers, that chronically cooled cells don't all survive. 70% survive rewarming. I'm not talking about the cooling, I'm talking about the rewarming process. And here's an example of different cell types. Vitrification can, of course, help and is being used. But the magnetic nanoparticles have been used to provide inductive heating clinically in the use of cancer, as well as for chronically stored tissues, but only very small amounts. That being said, if we've got a handle and access to the circulation through good perfusion, then the possibility of distributing these particles within the organs of cells and possibly an entire body may be a practical proposition for practical rewarming rather than just trying to dunk the cells in a pot somewhere. So that really is the, apart from just to say that with inductive heating, there are issues with these particles. One is particle size. What particle size do we choose? The suggestion is that we actually don't use nanoparticles, but we use microparticles of around about 2 to 4 microns. The reason for that is because as they are platelet size, they're going to stay in the circulation. Nanoparticles will tend to get into the extracellular spaces and perhaps into the cells themselves and be an issue to remove in subsequent rewarming, whereas microparticles staying in the capillary beds in the circulation can presumably be flushed out once the recovering patient is reaching post-freezing temperatures. And so just to summarize, I'd just like to say that I hope I've implied the problem of energy loss and the problem of the cytokine storm, how mild hypothermia, can buy us a little bit of time for an extra therapies, how the DCD model in transplantation, organ transplantation, points the way for improving techniques for a perfusion for the chronic patients to try and restore them to a pre-agonal state as though they'd never actually lost the circulation, which would, and then finally, if the prospect of inductive warming through either ultrasonics or magnetic systems is practicable for chronics, those then can be infused into the patient. But clearly all of these elements are going to be complex and are going to increase the complexity of the procedure. So, but the idea is simply very simple, to try and improve the odds. So by improving the odds of suspension, also improving the odds of it will work overall. And with that, I'll leave the last word to...
What's the only particle of hope I have, and it's just a particle, is to be frozen.
So let's hope that we can increase that particle by 10%, or not 10%, by 10-fold. Thank you very much.
David, great talk. There are 2 questions for which we have time currently. One would be, in your opinion, oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. The right one is, how do you judge the utility of current perfusion technologies for ex vivo, so isolated organs, for studying systemic perfusion?
It's a great question. There's lots of systems now where we use isolated organs, where we put isolated organs on perfusion systems. So I've been intimately involved in, for a long time, a system called Organox, which is for taking isolated liver and using that and so recovering isolated organs for subsequent transplantation. There are similar systems for hearts. There are similar systems for lungs, and there are more simple systems for kidneys. So there's been lots of interest and lots of development over the past few years to try and move from putting donor organs just on ice or in a cold bag to put them on an active perfusion system, which buys additional time. So the idea is that then you can get something instead of having to let's say retransplant a heart within 4 hours or so, that you might have 24 hours in which to get the job done. I don't know if that answered the question, but that's my answer.
Fair enough. I can't unfortunately here ask back to the audience. Maybe really quickly, last question. What is used to capture the cytokines? Okay,
cytokine, there's in the past we were using something called a leukocyte depletion filter, which is it's just a simple screen filter, high capacity screen filter, which has got, but it has limited capacity. So so that's how it's performed. We're now moving to, for this kind of problem, now moving to these high capacity absorbers, which are in themselves microparticles, and they've been coated so that the cytokines will stick to it and so be lost to the main circulation. These work to about 55,000 Daltons, so they're medium-sized molecules that they can absorb. So that's the kind of technology that's being used. That being said, it's a technology that really hasn't received FDA approval yet, but because of the COVID problem, these things have been rushed into clinical use. That means that we've suddenly got a lot of information, or developing a lot of information, on the utility of such devices. So it really is landing.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Talk to you later.
Thank you. Bye.